Hello everyone, I'm Komla Dumor. Welcome to Focus on Africa. Here are our top stories tonight. Is there a risk of genocide? A top UN official warns the conflict in the Central African Republic is looking increasingly like Rwanda and Bosnia. A BBC team in the northwest of the country has witnessed the tensions firsthand.
The violence is out of control now. We don't have a choice. We must leave or get killed.
If the Muslims don't leave, we must continue fighting.
As the murder investigation into the death of Rwanda's former spy chief continues, Paul Karegeya's nephew speaks exclusively to Focus on Africa.
It was a state of disbelief. At first, I just thought it was in a movie. I never knew that I would see him like that.
And I'm Catherine Biarahanga, live in Kampala, where President Museveni is for the moment refusing to sign a controversial anti-gay bill that members of parliament passed last month.
Meanwhile, across the continent, Nigeria's government defends its decision to bring in similar anti-gay laws earlier this week.
Nigeria has systematically passed laws to prohibit these practices that are not in tandem with the tradition of the people.
Also on this program, a plea for peace.
Get this song to the common people, caught in the middle of this common evil.
He was a former child soldier in the Sudanese civil war whose life took a very different turn after it ended. Emmanuel Jal joins us live in the Focus on Africa studio. We'll ask him how he feels about seeing his country at war yet again. And in sports, South Africa's Kevin Anderson keeps the continent's flag flying at the Australian Tennis Open. Hello everyone, welcome to Focus on Africa from BBC World News. My name is Komla Dumor. First, a stark warning from the United Nations. The conflict between Muslims and Christians in the Central African Republic could descend into genocide. A former senior UN official who's just returned from a 5-day visit in the country says the violence has all the elements seen in previous conflicts like Bosnia and Rwanda. The BBC's Thomas Fessi reports now from Bozoum, where he has seen firsthand the fine line between life and death among the country's rival communities.
Unleashed to kill. Wounded with head cuts, but alive. A Muslim man saved by African peacekeepers. He's accused of fighting with the Seleka forces, which have controlled this country for almost a year. We must kill him, he shouts. Only the gun makes a difference in front of a lynch mob. These Christian militiamen, or anti-Balaka, are on the hunt and they want revenge. There are only 11 African Union soldiers here. They've just prevented a man from being killed, but can they save the next one? We've come to meet the Imam, Ahmed Mohammed. Just last night, his house was attacked. More than 1,000 Muslims were evacuated this week. Those like Imam Mohammed, who thought they could stay, now say there is no alternative.
In 40 years, we have never seen that. But the violence is out of control now. We don't have a choice. We must leave or get killed.
Time seems up for some, but for the Christian displaced, could this mean a safe passage back to their neighborhood? Many here have lost relatives, and the church became their only sanctuary. We've had enough and we want to go home, he says, but an international force must come to protect us. We live in fear.
Even though their homes are just down this hill, the people around me chose to camp out here by the church for more than a month. They're returning home today, but they're not sure of what they will find. On the roads north and south to the town of Bozoum, villagers have nowhere to return. They're still hiding in the forest.
Signs of the brutality they have faced. An estimated 1,300 houses were burned down last week. Jérôme Gaina worked at the parish here. He was captured, beaten and held for 3 days, deprived of water and food. There is nothing left in his house but cold ashes. The man who negotiated his release, Father Aurelio, an Italian priest. After nearly 25 years in this country, he has seen rebellions and coups, but he is now dealing with unprecedented sectarian violence. Without a stronger international force around, he may be the last chance of mediation between the communities here.
If the Muslims don't leave, we must continue fighting.
Few believe that the new interim authorities will avert the hatred that has emerged in the last few months. Mass killings remain a major risk. Thomas Fessy, BBC News, Bozoum.
Let's take a look at some of the other African and global news stories we're covering on Focus on Africa. The UN has classified the situation in South Sudan as an internal armed conflict, meaning abuses committed there can be described as war crimes. A top UN official in the country said he had reports of mass killing, sexual violence, and the use of child soldiers, and that abuses have taken place on both sides of the conflict. President Barack Obama has called for an end to his government's control of phone data. The move follows revelations provided by the former intelligence contractor Edward Snowden that the National Security Agency has collected almost 200 million text messages a day from across the globe. The UN says it is struggling to get peacekeeping troops into Mali. The UN wants just over 11,000 troops to better tackle extremist groups in the north of the country. The current deployment is half that number, despite an influx of Chinese troops this week. Now, the United States has strongly condemned the killing in South Africa of the Rwandan former intelligence chief Patrick Karegeya. Mr. Karegeya, who was living in exile, was found dead in a hotel room earlier this month. The U.S. has also expressed concern about recent statements by the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, in which he warned that those who betrayed the country would, quote, face the consequences. Mr. Karegeya's nephew, David Batenga, is now in Johannesburg. He described to Focus on Africa's Nomsa Maseko how he felt when he arrived on the crime scene.
It's hard to describe. I wish I could. It was a state of disbelief. At first, I just thought it was in a movie. I never knew that I would see him like that. It took time to adjust that actually him. His shirt was his fingers was his forehead was his jeans, the shoes on the floor. It was him, but I didn't want to believe it's him.
Are you aware in terms of where the investigation is, any arrests, what's going on now?
No, I'm not aware of anything. I have engaged with the special crime unit and the police here. I'm not getting anything from them. They've told me that they are going to brief me when everything's ready. So I'm just playing patience card.
Now, the Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, has been making statements to the effect that treason has consequences. Do you believe this was pointing a finger at your deceased uncle?
I would say it's disappointing because for starters, you have to understand what treason means, and I actually don't even know what he was referring to, if he's actually pointing a finger to Karegeya, the deceased, or if he was saying to somebody else. But as a family, it is something that is very heartening to find that somebody who is a father, somebody who is a leader, can air those statements in front.
Let's move on to a subject that's generated a lot of debate this week. Legislation about homosexuality in Africa has come under scrutiny with the passing of a same-sex marriage bill in Nigeria by President Goodluck Jonathan and Uganda's President Museveni's refusal to sign a similar bill into law. He was quoted as saying homosexuals can be rescued by economic empowerment. As countries across the continent treat this issue differently, let's take a look at legislation on the continent. Now, in the majority of countries in Africa, same-sex relationships are illegal. Among them, Nigeria, Uganda, and Ethiopia, as highlighted there in red. In Egypt and Libya, legislation on consensual same-sex relationships is unclear. These are the countries where same-sex relationships are legal. Well, we spoke to Nigeria's Interior Minister, Mr. Abba Moro, and asked him why his government has introduced such a law.
If gayism or same-sex practice has been imported from outside that seeks to distort, that seeks to adulterate the practice of the Nigerian people, Nigeria, as a sovereign country, reserved the right to pass a law prohibiting it. It's just like armed robbery. It's just like kidnapping. It's just like terrorism. All these are practices that are aberrations, that are anti-people, that are anti-laws, anti-regulations, and anti-tradition of the Nigerian people. And Nigeria has systematically passed laws to prohibit these practices that are not in tandem with the tradition of the people, that are not in...
Well, from Nigeria, let's cross the continent now. Uganda's President Yoweri Museveni has blocked the controversial anti-gay bill that members of parliament passed last month. The bill included life imprisonment for homosexual acts and made the failure to report gay people to the police a crime. Let's get a bit of an explanation now about President Museveni's comments. The BBC's Catherine Biaruhanga joins us from Kampala. Clarify it for us. What did the president mean, and what's behind his decision to block this bill?
Well, what the president understands, as we've seen in the case of Nigeria, is that if you pass legislation like this, there would be a huge international backlash. And countries like the UK have suggested that they would suspend aid if this law is passed in Uganda. He knows that within the parliament there is overwhelming support for the legislation. If he chooses not to sign it, the parliament can still force it through with a 2/3 vote. So in this letter, he's just trying to reach a compromise with them and try to convince them that, you do not need this legislation in Uganda today.
Catherine, has there been any reaction from either MPs or even the gay community in Uganda?
Well, many MPs, most of them do belong to the president's party, are standing firm in their decision. There's meant to be a meeting of the ruling party, and many of them say that they will look at the president and say, we're going to go ahead and vote for this bill. The gay community is a bit skeptical about the president's statements. For example, he said that lesbianism begins because women are starved of sex. So they're a bit cautious of those comments, but they do know that he is their only hope in making sure that this legislation is not passed.
Catherine Biaruhanga in Kampala. Catherine, good to see you. You're watching Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Komla Dumor. A little late in the program, Peter's in with all the sports news, including the Nigerian international defender Elderson Echiejile joins the French club Monaco on a 4-year deal. And not an accolade to be proud of, as Ivory Coast leads Africa in 2014 for receiving the most online fraud complaints. How will the government respond? Hello everyone, I'm Komla Dumor. You're watching BBC Focus on Africa. Here are our top stories. A top UN official, John Ging, has warned of the danger of genocide in the Central African Republic. He said the conflict had the elements as seen in places like Rwanda and Bosnia. The president of Uganda, Yoweri Museveni, has refused to approve a controversial bill that would toughen anti-gay laws. Now, cybercrime is a serious menace for internet users, and Ivory Coast is a particular hotspot. According to the Ivorian government, it received more complaints about web-based fraud in the first half of last year than any other country in Africa. However, it's also the first to set up a dedicated task force to combat the problem. From Abidjan, Tamazin Ford has the story.
Phishing, hacking, phreaking, 419 scams, whatever you call it, cybercrime is on the rise in Ivory Coast. This man would only be filmed anonymously, and though he no longer breaks the law, he used to cheat people out of money by striking up fake relationships over the internet. He started when he was just 16 years old.
What works the best is what we call love. You make yourself a man or woman who is looking for love. Then you start chatting and exchange photos. After that comes what we call the tax. You say, okay, I want to come back to France, but I have some debts. I need, for example, 5,000 euros. My parents have left me a fortune, so once I'm home, I can pay you back.
It's not hard to find cybercriminals in Abidjan. Ivorian artists have written songs about them. In this one, naming their virtual identities. That gives you some idea of the extent of the problem here. 2 years ago, the government set up a dedicated task force to fight cybercrime, the first in Africa. According to reports, nearly half of all complaints come from France. The love method described earlier is the most common way victims are duped. And in total, police have recorded close to $15 million in defrauded money. The online community is trying to tackle cybercrime too. This year, they voted for Abidjan's first web mayor. His main aim is to teach young people about legitimate ways to earn money online.
Sometimes we try to meet them in the workplaces, generally in the cybercafes, in order to sensitize them to quit the darkness in which they are destroying the image of our country, to come to the light, to adopt new web activities so they contribute to the rising of our country.
Close to 100 cybercriminals were arrested last year. A tough cybercrime law brought in last May has introduced prison sentences of up to 20 years. Enough to steer some onto the right side of the law.
You know, when I was doing it, some part of me felt guilty. But then you just say to yourself, it's only money. So no, now I don't have any regrets.
He shows little remorse. He's now studying IT at university instead. Ivory Coast has set up partnerships with law enforcement agencies in Europe, the FBI in the US, as well as other African countries. It wants the world to know it's serious about tackling the problem. Tamasin Ford, BBC News, Ivory Coast.
Now, sitting alongside me is a man who fought as a child soldier in the Sudanese Civil War, which began in the 80s and ended in 2005. After being rescued by an aid worker, Emmanuel Jal's life took a very different turn. He's now an international music star and an activist for children in war zones. Let's take a listen to some of his music, and you might just recognize a few of the faces in the video.
That's why I am. I'm calling on the whole wide world. Come on, people, won't you help me? Help me scream and shout. Let's scream and shout, 'cause we want peace. And we want peace. To say the least, I dedicate this song to the common people.
I saw Alicia Keys, George Clooney, but the star himself, the track We Want Peace. Emmanuel Jal, welcome to Focus on Africa. Great to have you in. Let's talk about what's happening in your country right now. You fought in a war. You were a child. We've been covering this story from South Sudan for many weeks now. How does it make you feel when you see the images of your countrymen and women in such pain, in such suffering? How do you sleep at night?
There's no sleep for me seeing the day it started, you know. I have few days where I can sleep. It's hard to believe also that it's actually happening. Everybody in South Sudan is terrified. And personally, war have reached the core of my family again, because when it happened in Juba, 3 of my cousins died and my brothers disappeared. And recently, 3 days ago, I got a phone call and I was told my brother was killed. And the way he was killed was he decided to stay in Bantu, thinking the government forces are going to come in and he's going to be safe. So my other brother escaped. Then they called him. And then he picked the phone and then they told him, we're going to kill your brother.
The tragedy is that many families are getting calls like this. Many people in Sudan are hearing this kind of news. I wonder, when you think about where the country has gone, what it's been through, how far a setback is this? How many years has South Sudan been forced back?
South Sudan, like, we have been forced back so fast. But the hope which is there is civilians are saving each other. And there's a room to save the country because it's men in the uniform that are killing people. So both the rebels and the government are committing atrocities. And so what we're lacking when we got our independence was institution in place to protect human rights, justice, equality, and freedom for everybody.
Well, you've been a bit critical of President Salva Kiir. You say you were tweeting that he just wants the oil. You blame him for the state of affairs. Some say that you are an international star. You should be above the politics, that you should be a voice of reason.
Well, I'm an activist. An activist identifies a situation and you talk about it clearly to put a spotlight. I'm not a politician to weigh. Just like when there was war with Khartoum, I just stick to my messaging. The only problem is now it's
the wars with each other now.
Yes. And so it's a political situation that almost turned tribal. But we can rescue it now. What is peace? Peace is justice, equality, and freedom for all. Peace is when my belly is full, and an empty belly is a gold mine for politicians. And you see, peace is when conflicts are managed in a mature manner, the violence is prevented. The president is the one who should manage the conflict. The party wanted to transform to be democratic and accountable. That's where the battle began.
Emmanuel, we just have a few seconds left. There are several hundreds of thousands of South Sudanese who watch this program across the continent and are looking for a message of hope. What do you say to your fellow countrymen and women who are hanging on to every word that you share?
What I'll say, guys, nobody's going to bring peace to our country except us. And most of the people who are now trying to be the puppets, be the string pulling the puppets for our leaders to fight, are interested in our resources. Once we're at war, when there's peace, our country is going to be at debt. We have the power to pull our politicians to give us the peace we want.
Emmanuel, great to have you on the program, my man.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. All right, Emmanuel Jal, Focus on Africa. And now, the other big man from the newsroom, Peter Okoje.
Thank you very much.
Hello, sir.
KD, now South Africa's Kevin Anderson continues to keep Africa's hopes alive in Melbourne, Australia at the Tennis Open. Of course, Anderson, seeded 19th, fought back from 2 sets down against unseeded Frenchman Edouard Roger Vasselin to make it through to the 4th round with a 3-6, 4-6, 6-3, 7-6, 7-5 win. It means Anderson has equaled his best ever performance at a Grand Slam, but can he make it to the quarterfinals for the first time? Well, to do that, he'll have to beat the world number 7 and 7th seed Thomas Berdych of the Czech Republic. So another huge task ahead of him. Onto football, and Nigeria international defender Elderson Echejile has joined big spending French league side Monaco from Portuguese club Sporting Braga on a 4-year deal. His contract with Braga was due to end in June, and he returns to France having spent 3 years with Rennes from 2007. The 25-year-old played every match for Nigeria as they won the Africa Cup of Nations in South Africa last year. Monaco are second in league, 5 points behind leaders Paris Saint-Germain. Here in England, the Premier League continues this weekend. The pick of the ties takes place on Sunday when Chelsea host current champions Manchester United. League leaders Arsenal, seen here in training, are at home to Fulham. The Gunners have not beaten Fulham at the Emirates since 2010, but the Cottagers have the worst defence record in the league this season. Arsenal manager Arsene Wenger says there is no room for any mistakes. Wenger was also asked if he is close to bringing in any new signings during the January transfer window.
I'm curious as well, of course. I'm curious, it's my nature, but the transfer period lasts until the 31st of January. Are we close to sign anybody? Not at the moment, I would say no.
And finally, here's one that comes under the category of please do not try this at home. It's the sport of husband throwing. It may not be an Olympic sport yet, but in Japan's central prefecture of Niigata, it has been going on since the 18th century. It supposedly started as retaliation by men against outsiders who married local girls. 3 newly married couples took part in the event this year. The kimono-clad husbands were carried to the top of the hill and thrown one by one into 2 meters of snow. They rolled down the slope to their waiting wives. You know what? It's a good thing that they do this when they're just newlywed, because after 7 or 10 years, they might throw them down the stairs.
Well, I'm sure it's crossed my missus' mind a few times. Thanks a lot, Peter. And that's it from Focus on Africa. Thanks for being with us. Bye-bye.